Read the Herculaneum papyri. The year is 79 CE. Vesuvius doesn't just bury Herculaneum in ash. It seals a library, an entire private collection of roughly 1,800 scrolls carbonized in an instant, locked inside the only complete ancient library to survive from the classical world. For nearly 3 centuries after their rediscovery in 1752, attempts to unroll them were largely destructive. Early physical methods using machines and chemical treatments routinely crumbled the fragile layers, and scholars watched irreplaceable text disintegrate before it could be recorded. Then, in late 2023, a 21-year-old student named Luke Farritor used artificial intelligence trained on CT scans to read the first complete word recovered from inside an unopened scroll, the Greek word for purple. Building on that breakthrough, Farritor joined forces with 2 other researchers, and together they won the Vesuvius Challenge Grand Prize in early 2024, decoding more than 2,000 characters across 15 passages from a single sealed scroll. Those passages describe a philosophical discussion of pleasure, music, food, the good life, a text that had gone unread since the eruption. Nobody on Earth had known it existed. That was one scroll. Roughly 1,500 remain sealed. Papyrologist Richard Janko has specifically suggested that works by Aristotle, Sappho, and Ennius may be sitting inside them right now, unread. The villa's owner is believed to have been Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus, Julius Caesar's own father-in-law, which would explain the extraordinary caliber of the collection. The mainstream explanation is simple. Carbonized papyrus is extraordinarily fragile, and the technology to read it without destroying it simply didn't exist until the 21st century. What it does not fully account for is why excavation stalled so completely after 1765, halted primarily due to complaints from residents living above the site, with attention shifting to the easier dig at Pompeii, and the tunnels routinely backfilled as standard practice throughout. The villa's exact location was then lost for 2 centuries. Even today, the Italian government has declined full re-excavation, citing conservation priorities, the presence of inhabited buildings directly above the site, and the enormous logistical and political challenges involved, including reported concerns about organized crime in the area. What else is in there? And who decided the world wasn't ready to find out? The Dendera Zodiac. It took dynamite. In 1820, a French engineer named Sébastien Saulnier hired a team to blast the oldest complete star map in human history out of the ceiling of a living temple, because France wanted it more than Egypt did. The Dendera Zodiac, carved into the pronaos ceiling of the Temple of Hathor sometime around 50 BCE, was ripped from its context as a roughly 10 metric ton sandstone slab shipped across the Mediterranean and sold to King Louis XVIII for 150,000 francs. It now sits in the Louvre under inventory number D38. A plaster replica replaced it in the temple. The problem is what Saulnier's team destroyed in the process. Egyptologist Sylvie Covell, who spent decades reconstructing the original ceiling, documented that the dynamite extraction cracked and obliterated surrounding hieroglyphic inscriptions on at least 3 adjacent panels. Those panels were part of the same astronomical text. They are gone permanently. The zodiac itself encodes something that scholars still cannot agree on. Jean-Baptiste Biot calculated in 1823 that the star positions correspond to approximately 700 BCE. Researcher Robert Bauval has argued the precession data points to roughly 4,500 BCE. The mainstream position is that it's a Greco-Roman decorative ceiling from the 1st century BCE. But if the surrounding inscriptions contained the interpretive key to the zodiac's dating mechanism, then their destruction wasn't just an act of colonial looting. It was the permanent erasure of the one piece of context that could have resolved the argument entirely. The Copper Scroll. Every other Dead Sea Scroll contains scripture, prophecy, or ritual law. This one is a treasure map. Found in Cave 3 at Qumran in 1952 and cut into 23 strips by mechanical engineering professor H. Wright Baker at the Manchester College of Technology, with the first cut made on October 1, 1955, the Copper Scroll lists 64 locations of buried gold and silver. The total weight, when calculated, exceeds 170 tons of precious metal. That figure is larger than any documented treasury in the entire ancient Near East. It is multiple times larger than the total treasure of the Second Temple as recorded by Josephus. John Marco Allegro, the only non-clerical scholar on the original Dead Sea Scrolls editorial team, performed the first translation and immediately grasped what he was reading. He published a partial account in 1960. The official committee distanced themselves from him. Joseph Milik, the scroll's designated editor, publicly dismissed the treasure as fictional in his 1962 translation, without ever explaining why a fictional document would specify burial depths in cubits and name individual cisterns and landmarks with the precision of an engineering report. Allegro insisted the deposits were real until the end of his career. His reputation was systematically dismantled. He was removed from the editorial team. Some researchers ask whether the scroll describes a cache assembled from sources far older than the Second Temple, a treasury whose true origin would require rewriting the economic history of the ancient world. The scroll is currently held in the Jordan Museum in Amman. No government has ever funded a serious archaeological search of even one of the 64 listed locations, the Rongorongo of Rapa Nui. When Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Island on April 5, 1722, he encountered a society that, while significantly reduced from its earlier peak, still maintained functioning communities and standing monuments. The population collapse that followed was driven largely by what outside contact would bring, and a writing system that no other culture in all of Oceania had ever independently invented. The wooden tablets covered in a script called Rongorongo were remarkable for their isolation alone. What happened next was surgical. Beginning in December 1862, Peruvian slave raiders struck Easter Island in a series of raids that continued for several months, eventually abducting approximately 1,500 people, roughly half the remaining population. Among those taken were the island's paramount chief, his heir, and those who knew how to read the Rongorongo script. The literate class of an entire civilization was gone within months. By 1866, when Bishop Florentin Etienne Yausen in Tahiti organized a translation attempt, he could locate only one surviving reader. That man, Matoro Tawa Ur, could chant the tablets but could not render them into French in any verifiable way. Thomas Barthel cataloged 26 surviving Rongorongo objects in 1958, containing roughly 14,000 individual glyphs. Stephen Fisher proposed a partial translation of the Santiago staff tablet in 1997, identifying what may be a creation chant. His reading remains disputed. The script shows structural characteristics of true logosyllabic writing, the same complexity as early Sumerian cuneiform. Some researchers have noted a possible structural similarity to the undeciphered Indus Valley script, which may be coincidence or may be something worth pursuing. The island's population, estimated at up to 15,000 at its pre-contact peak, had already fallen to around 2,000 to 3,000 by the time Roggeveen arrived in 1722. It continued to collapse under European disease, slave raiding, and emigration, reaching a recorded low of 111 survivors by the 1877 census. The knowledge didn't fade, it was taken: the Nacal Tablets. In 1868, a British Army officer named James Churchward sat with a Hindu priest in an undisclosed monastery in India. The priest produced a set of clay tablets written in a language he called Nyashal, the sacred tongue of a civilization Churchward would later describe as the motherland of Mu, a Pacific continent he believed had sunk beneath the ocean roughly 12,000 years ago. 2,600 tablets, the priest reportedly said. Churchward spent years learning to read them. Then the priest died. The tablets disappeared. Churchward published 5 books between 1926 and 1935, documenting what he claimed to have read, and his account might be entirely dismissed if not for one uncomfortable coincidence. Between 1921 and 1923, a documented archaeologist named William Niven excavated the Valley of Mexico and recovered 2,600 stone tablets containing symbols that bore structural resemblance to the Nacal vocabulary Churchward had illustrated from memory years before Niven's excavations. The two men only compared notes after Niven published in 1923. Independent researcher Augustus Le Plongeon had described hidden Pacific records with similar iconography in 1896, drawing only from Mayan sources 30 years before Churchward and with no knowledge of his work. Mainstream archaeology dismisses Churchward as a romantic fantasist who provided no verifiable location and no physical evidence. That is a fair assessment. The claimed convergence of 3 independent researchers working from India, Mexico, and the Yucatan, arriving at superficially similar symbolic vocabularies without documented collaboration, has been noted by some writers as intriguing, though no independent archaeologist has confirmed that Niven's tablets actually match Churchward's illustrated symbols, and Le Plongeon's own Mayan interpretations are themselves considered fringe scholarship. The pattern may say more about how humans find connections across unrelated sources than about any shared ancient origin. The Dresden Codex missing pages. On July 12, 1562, Bishop Diego de Landa stood in the plaza of Mani, Yucatan, and personally oversaw the burning of 27 Maya books. He recorded this himself, in his own words, in the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatan, written around 1566. He called it necessary. 4 Maya books survived the colonial period. One of them has pages missing, and they were not torn. When Ernst Fürstemann, the chief librarian of the Saxon State Library in Dresden, undertook the first serious analysis of the Dresden Codex between 1880 and 1902, he noted material evidence suggesting 6 to 8 leaves had been cut from the codex before it ever reached Europe. Cleaner edges, disrupted ink patterns, an altered quire structure. The codex's surviving 39 leaves contain astronomical data of staggering precision. The Venus tables, analyzed by Floyd Lounsbury of Yale in 1983, are accurate to within approximately 2 minutes per year, implying centuries of unbroken observation. The flood sequence at the codex's end, a full-page depiction of a sky serpent pouring catastrophic water onto a drowning earth, appears to begin mid-narrative. Eric Thompson, in his 1950 study of Maya hieroglyphic writing, acknowledged the structural gap without explanation. If the removed pages contained the preamble to that flood sequence, the specific celestial trigger, the date, the mechanism, their removal was precise enough to eliminate the most dangerous prediction in the entire document. Moisture and insects tear papyrus. Knives cut it. Someone knew exactly which pages to take. The Yonaguni Monument Government Survey. In 1986, a dive tour operator named Kihachiro Arataki was searching for hammerhead sharks off the coast of Yonaguni Island, Japan's westernmost point. He found something that has no agreed-upon explanation. A structure roughly 150 meters long, 40 meters wide, and 27 meters high, sitting 25 meters underwater, with right-angle intersections, parallel terraces, a triangular platform, and what appear to be post holes drilled to uniform depth. Professor Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus conducted 15 years of dives and published findings arguing the monument was at least partially man-made, estimating its construction during the last ice age when sea levels were approximately 40 meters lower than today. That would place construction at roughly 10,000 BCE, making it the oldest large-scale architectural structure on Earth by 5,000 years. Robert Schoch of Boston University, who also dived the site, argues it is a natural formation of Yonaguni's sedimentary mudstone, which fractures along natural right angles. His position represents mainstream geology. In 1997, Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs commissioned an independent geologic survey to settle the debate. That survey was completed. It was never published. Kimura confirmed in subsequent interviews that the findings were classified as internal administrative documents. Natural mudstone does not produce post holes drilled to uniform depth. It does not produce a carved anthropomorphic face feature. Even Schoch concedes the site shows signs of human modification. The one study that might have answered the central question has been locked in a government cabinet for nearly 30 years. Nobody has explained why. The Voynich manuscript. Somewhere between 1404 and 1438, someone wrote a 240-page illustrated book in a language that no human being has been able to read in 600 years. Not the NSA. Not William Friedman, the cryptanalyst who broke Japan's purple cipher during World War II and spent years on this manuscript privately. Not Gordon Rugg of Keele University, who spent years demonstrating that a table and grill method could produce text with statistically similar properties to the manuscript, an argument for a possible hoax, though other researchers disputed whether his method truly captured the manuscript's deeper structural complexity. The University of Arizona carbon dated the vellum in 2009 to 1404 through 1438 with 95% confidence. It is not a modern forgery. In 2013, Marcelo Montemuro of the University of Manchester published a study in PLOS 1 confirming the text obeys Zipf's law, the statistical property found in all natural human languages, and shows semantic word clustering consistent with real linguistic meaning. Something is being communicated. The manuscript was rediscovered in 1912 by book dealer Wilfrid Voynich at a Jesuit property near Rome, long attributed to Villa Mondragone in Frascati, though recent research suggests the actual location may have been Villa Torlonia in Castel Gandolfo. A letter tucked inside, dated 1666 and addressed to the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher, a polymath renowned across Europe for his work in linguistics, science, and ancient languages, indicated that Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II had paid 600 gold ducats for it around 1600 CE, believing it was the work of Roger Bacon. Kircher apparently never decoded it either. Approximately 32 pages were removed from the manuscript before Voynich found it. By whom, for what reason, and what those pages contained, we may never know. The Cahun Papyrus and the Book of Transformations. In 1889, Sir Flinders Petrie excavated the workers' town of Cahun in the Fayum region of Egypt and recovered the oldest surviving medical text focused on women's health in human history. He handed it to University College London. Francis Griffith finally published a full translation in 1898, 9 years after its discovery. The Cahun Papyrus describes a pregnancy test using wheat and barley seeds moistened with urine. In 1963, researchers Galiungi, Khalil, and Amar tested this against 40 pregnant and non-pregnant women and found it correctly identified pregnancy in approximately 70% of cases. The likely mechanism is elevated estrogen in pregnant urine accelerating germination. Ancient Egyptians had empirically discovered a hormonal pregnancy test roughly 3,800 years before modern medicine, without any biochemical framework to explain why it worked. The papyrus also describes a contraceptive formula using acacia gum, which ferments to lactic acid, a documented spermicide confirmed in modern clinical literature. The mainstream assessment is that this represents sophisticated empirical observation accumulated over generations. But the Berlin Medical Papyrus, dating to approximately 1200 BCE, repeatedly cites a source document called the Book of Transformations as the authority for its most complex procedures. The Ebers Papyrus, from roughly 1550 BCE, cites the same text. The language in both cases is procedural, not rhetorical. Phrases like "as written in the Book of Transformations for the treatment of." If that master document existed, everything we call Egyptian medicine is a footnote. The book itself has never been found. The forbidden room of Ashurbanipal's library. In 649 BCE, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal boasted in his own inscriptions that he could read clay tablets in Sumerian, a dead language even then, the way a modern emperor might brag of reading Linear A. He built the greatest library the ancient world had ever seen, roughly 30,000 cuneiform tablets covering astronomy, medicine, divination, and mythology, excavated from the mound of Kuyunjik at Nineveh by Austin Henry Layard beginning in 1849 and continued by Hormuz Rassam in 1853. The Epic of Gilgamesh, containing a flood narrative predating Genesis by at least 1,000 years, was found there. So was the Enuma Anu Enlil, 70 tablets of celestial omens whose eclipse predictions modern astronomers have verified to within hours. The diagnostic handbook found in that library describes symptoms, diagnoses, and prognoses in a methodological structure indistinguishable from modern clinical reasoning. These are what made it into the catalog. Ashurbanipal's own royal correspondence, studied by Alistair Livingston and documented in his 1986 work on Assyrian scholarly texts, references tablets labeled Secret of the Great Gods for the initiate only, pulled from temple libraries across the empire and housed separately from the main collection. Assyriologist Irving Finkel has identified catalog gaps in the British Museum's Kuyunjik holdings, suggesting portions of the excavation were never formally inventoried. Rassam himself was tried and acquitted on illegal antiquities charges in 1883. The mainstream view holds that 19th century archaeology was simply chaotic and poorly documented. But if Ashurbanipal was systematically collecting every restricted text in the ancient Near East into a sealed inner archive, the question is not whether that room existed. The question is whether anyone has ever honestly looked for what came out of it. 10 records, 10 removals, a library sealed under volcanic rock, a star map blasted off a ceiling, a treasure scroll whose translator was professionally destroyed, a writing system whose readers were kidnapped, a master medical text cited by every document that followed it, never found, a government survey locked in a cabinet for 30 years. The pattern, if you choose to call it one, is this. The records that vanished were not random. They were the most precise, the most specific, the most dangerous to establish timelines. Mainstream scholarship has reasonable explanations for most of them. Fragile materials, colonial chaos, bureaucratic inertia, and those explanations are often correct. But they don't account for the specificity of what disappeared, always the most inconvenient pages, always the most sensitive translations, always the surveys with the most uncomfortable results. You watch this far because your brain registered that pattern before your mind had words for it. That instinct is the beginning of real historical inquiry. Drop a comment with whichever record you think is the hardest to explain away, and subscribe if you want to keep pulling on these threads. The archive goes much deeper. The record that survives is the one no one thought dangerous. Somewhere in an unread scroll, a sealed report, or a flooded staircase, the answer is still waiting. Subscribe and keep looking.